When the movie began, I tried to focus on the storyline, but my thoughts kept drifting away. Leon was sitting closer than usual, and I couldn't shake the strange tension in the air. His demeanor seemed different, as though his attention was fixed on me in a way I hadn't noticed before. Even though we didn't exchange a single word throughout the film, I could feel his gaze on me more than once. Every time I turned slightly, he would quickly shift his eyes back to the screen, as if caught doing something he shouldn't. But the moment that truly stayed with me wasn't his lingering glances, it was when Leon leaned in, his voice low and gentle as he whispered near my ear. "Do you like the movie?" he asked. I nodded, doing my best to appear composed, but his tone sent an involuntary shiver through me. The warmth of his breath brushed against my skin, leaving a fleeting sensation that lingered far longer than it should have, an imprint I couldn't quite ignore. I am Leon's stepmother, a role I took on when I married his father a few years ago. Leon is a young man who carries himself with quiet confidence, a natural charisma that draws people in without him even trying. His sharp features, athletic build, and composed demeanor make him stand out in any room. Yet, behind that calm and self-assured exterior, there's a certain enigmatic quality about him, as though his true emotions are hidden beneath layers he doesn't let anyone see. Since the day I became part of this family, my relationship with Leon has always been polite and cordial, but there has always been a strange distance between us, one that neither of us has ever fully addressed. It's not hostility, nor indifference, but rather a quiet tension, like a barrier neither of us is willing to cross. At times, he's considerate and respectful, but his attentiveness feels calculated, as though he's measuring each gesture, each word. My husband, Leon's father, is a man deeply committed to his career. His work takes up most of his time, leaving him frequently absent from home. Long hours, business trips, and late-night meetings have become the norm, and I've grown accustomed to running the household without him. This has meant that Leon and I often find ourselves alone together more than I ever anticipated. In the beginning, I tried to fill these gaps with distractions, busy work, errands, or anything that would keep me occupied and out of the same space as Leon for too long. But Leon, it seemed, had no such reservations. He would engage me in casual conversations, asking me about my day, or suggesting we watch a movie or share a meal together. At first, I thought it was an effort to keep things amicable, perhaps out of respect for his father. Yet, over time, there was something about the way he spoke, the way his voice softened when addressing me, or the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long, that unsettled me. When my husband was home, I felt a wave of relief, as though the invisible weight I carried in Leon's presence had been lifted. But during those moments, I noticed a shift in Leon. His demeanor turned colder, more distant, as if the easygoing, attentive young man I had come to know only existed when his father wasn't around. It was a peculiar contrast, one that I couldn't quite make sense of. I told myself repeatedly that I was overthinking, that everything was perfectly normal. Leon was simply being kind, and any oddness I perceived was a projection of my own insecurities in this new role. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface, a subtle intensity in his interactions with me that I didn't know how to interpret. More and more, I began to notice the way Leon's presence lingered in the room, even when he wasn't saying anything. His glances felt deliberate, his words measured, and his gestures, though small, seemed to carry a weight I couldn't ignore. And as much as I tried to dismiss these thoughts, they gnawed at me, making me question what was truly happening between us and where this unspoken tension might lead. One quiet evening, as I was tidying up the living room, Leon suddenly approached me. His tone was calm but purposeful as he said, "Are you free this weekend? I'd like to invite you to a movie." His words, though simple, stopped me in my tracks. Leon had never asked me to go anywhere with him, let alone suggested spending time together, just the two of us. The unexpectedness of the moment made my heart skip a beat, a subtle unease creeping in before I could even respond. I looked up at him, studying his face. Leon stood there, composed as always, his confidence radiating effortlessly. But there was something different about him at that moment, something in his gaze, steady yet unreadable, that unsettled me. "A movie?" I repeated, my voice tinged with hesitation. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "Yes. It's been a while since I've gone out with anyone. I thought it might be nice for us to spend some time together." His tone was casual, but there was a gravity to his words that I couldn't quite place, as though there was more to this invitation than he was letting on. I forced a small smile, trying to suppress the strange feeling growing in my chest. "That sounds nice," I said, though my voice faltered slightly. Leon's suggestion seemed innocent enough, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Why now? Why this sudden desire to spend time with me? My thoughts spiraled as I stood there, searching for a reason to decline, but none came. I couldn't very well reject what appeared to be a genuine attempt to connect. After all, wasn't this what I had wanted? To build a better relationship with Leon, to bridge the subtle but ever-present gap between us. Yet, as much as I tried to convince myself, there was a weight in the air, an unspoken tension that made my chest tighten. Finally, I nodded. "All right," I said, keeping my voice as light as possible. "Maybe this will be a good chance for us to spend some quality time together." I tried to focus on the positive, on the possibility of strengthening the bond between us. But even as I said it, a faint unease lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. That night, as I lay in bed, the scene replayed in my mind. Leon's calm demeanor, his steady gaze, the warmth in his voice, it all seemed so normal, and yet it wasn't. I told myself I was overthinking, that this was nothing more than an innocent outing. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the flicker of doubt that refused to be silenced. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. What was it about this invitation that felt so strange? Was it his sudden interest in spending time with me, or the way his voice seemed to linger in my mind, long after the words were spoken? I didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain, this wasn't going to be an ordinary trip to the movies. And that realization left me both curious and apprehensive, my heart beating faster at the thought of what might come next. The theater was bustling with people, the hum of chatter and excitement filling the air. Yet somehow, Leon had managed to secure seats right in the center of the auditorium, prime spots for the perfect view. As we made our way to our seats, he gestured for me to sit first, his hand lightly brushing my arm. It was a small gesture, perhaps meaningless on the surface, but it lingered in my mind longer than it should have. From the moment we settled into our seats, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was different. Leon seemed unusually attentive, his posture leaning subtly in my direction, his gaze lingering on me for just a moment too long before he turned back to the screen. Even his tone, when he asked if I was comfortable, carried a warmth that felt slightly out of place. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was imagining things, but the dim light of the theater only heightened the tension. The faint glow of the screen cast shifting shadows across his face, making his expressions harder to read. Every time I caught him glancing my way, I felt my pulse quicken, a mix of confusion and unease washing over me. The film began, but I found it impossible to focus on the story. My thoughts were elsewhere, on the closeness of Leon's presence, the way his arm occasionally brushed mine, the air between us seeming heavier than it should have been. Each subtle movement, each quiet moment, seemed charged with something I couldn't name. The usual boundaries between us felt blurred, as though the darkness of the theater had created a space where rules no longer applied. I stared at the screen, willing myself to concentrate, but the tension was suffocating. The film's dialogue became a blur, the plot slipping away from me entirely. All I could feel was the quiet, undeniable pull of something unspoken, something that made my chest tighten and my thoughts spin. As the movie flickered on the screen, the atmosphere between us grew increasingly charged. At first, Leon's hand brushed against mine, a casual contact that I tried to dismiss. But then, it happened again, this time, more deliberate, his fingers grazing mine with a quiet intention that sent a jolt of electricity through me. I could feel his touch lingering, his hand resting near mine, and despite every warning bell in my mind, I found myself unable to move away. His gaze, deep and unwavering, locked onto mine, making it impossible to ignore him. His eyes were so intense, so full of something unspoken, that every time I caught his stare, I felt my breath catch. When he leaned in close to whisper, his voice was low, almost seductive. "Are you enjoying the movie?" The words seemed innocuous, yet they felt like an invitation, one that threatened to pull me deeper into a world I knew I shouldn't be in. A tremor ran through me, a mix of confusion and longing. I told myself to pull away, to create distance. This was wrong, I reminded myself. Leon was my stepson, and yet the proximity between us, the warmth of his breath against my skin, was too much to ignore. There was a magnetism in his presence, a raw intensity that made my body react before my mind could catch up. Every time his hand brushed mine, my heart beat faster, my pulse quickening as if to say that something was shifting, something I wasn't prepared for. I fought the rising tide of desire, but with each touch, each whisper, I felt it becoming harder to resist. His presence seemed to envelop me, his every move sending shockwaves through my thoughts. I knew I had to stop him, to push him away before things went too far. But the closer he got, the more I found myself drawn in, unable to separate the thrill of the moment from the overwhelming guilt that crept in. The more he touched me, the more his presence consumed me, and I couldn't tell where the danger ended and the desire began. Leon's hand wrapped around mine with a sudden, possessive force, and the raw intensity in his eyes left me breathless. It wasn't just a touch, it was a claim, an assertion that sent a shiver of excitement and dread running through me. His gaze locked onto mine, dark and full of longing, as if he could see straight through me, to the deepest parts one was trying to ignore. Time seemed to slow as I realized what was happening. His face was inching closer, his breath hot against my skin, and before I could think, his lips hovered near my ear. My body tensed, every muscle screaming to move, to escape, but something inside me was frozen, caught between fear and something darker, more thrilling. In that split second, as he leaned in even closer, my heart hammered in my chest, a voice inside me screaming to push him away. I shoved him back with every ounce of strength I had, panic seizing my chest. The force of it surprised him, and for a moment, we both stood there, breathless, as if the world around us had paused. A rush of anger and disbelief flooded through me. How had I let it get this far? How had I let us, slip into this moment of madness? My mind was a whirlwind of guilt, confusion, and something else I couldn't even name. I couldn't stay there, couldn't breathe in that heavy, charged air any longer. Without another word, I yanked my hand from his grasp and bolted out of the theater. My heart pounded in my ears as I rushed for the exit, the weight of what had almost happened suffocating me. Behind me, I could hear him stirring, the confusion in his movements as he realized what had just occurred. But I didn't dare look back. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, the adrenaline still surging through me. I was shaken, lost in a storm of conflicting emotions. I had to get away, get as far from him, from this, as possible. I didn't know how to make sense of what had just happened, but one thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. On the way home, I was overwhelmed by a flood of emotions, guilt, shame, and a simmering anger toward myself for letting everything spiral out of control. The guilt gnawed at me, each thought of what had almost happened sending waves of discomfort through me. I couldn't shake the image of Leon's gaze, the intensity of his touch, the closeness that had been too much, yet too tantalizing to resist in the moment. But there was something else I couldn't ignore, a part of me that ached with the reminder of how his attention had made me feel, desired, wanted, seen in ways I hadn't been in years. My husband had long since stopped making me feel this way, his absence and indifference a dull ache in my heart. In that instant, Leon had given me something I hadn't realized I was craving, something I shouldn't have wanted, but still, a part of me had. My phone buzzed, Leon's name flashing on the screen. He had tried calling multiple times, leaving messages full of apologies, each one heavier than the last. He wanted to talk, to explain, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I didn't have the words to explain why I couldn't. I didn't want to hear him anymore, not yet, not while my mind was still spinning, wrestling with emotions I didn't know how to process. I let the phone ring, the silence between us growing louder with each unanswered call. A week later, Ethan came to me with a confession that I wasn't ready to hear. He told me, with a vulnerability I hadn't expected, that he had developed feelings for me long ago. His words were heavy with sincerity, and as he spoke, I could see the torment in his eyes. He explained that the coldness he felt from his father had left him yearning for warmth, something he believed he could find in me. But now, after everything, he regretted it all. He regretted making me feel uncomfortable, putting us both in this position. His confession struck me deeper than I wanted to admit. There was something in his voice, something raw and honest, that made my heart ache. But despite the emotions stirring within me, I knew that I couldn't allow this to go any further. The boundaries had been crossed, and they couldn't be undone. "I'm sorry, Ethan," I said, my voice steady but firm. "This can't continue. We have to stop this here." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself as I spoke the words I knew were necessary but felt so difficult to say. "You need to focus on your future. You need to let go of these thoughts, these feelings, and move forward. There's a path ahead of you that doesn't involve this mistake." I looked at him, hoping he could see the seriousness in my eyes. His emotions were valid, but so were the consequences of crossing a line that should never have been touched. The confrontation erupted like an uncontrollable wildfire, consuming everything in its path. It began with a sharp, disbelieving exclamation from my husband as he stood frozen, the glow of Ethan's incriminating messages illuminating his face. His eyes darkened with fury, his voice trembling as he growled, "What the hell is this?" He shoved the phone toward me, his hands shaking. My throat went dry. I didn't even need to look at the screen, I knew exactly what he had found. My mind raced for an explanation, but the words stuck, tangled in my panic. "You're quiet," he snapped, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Explain this. Now." I opened my mouth, struggling to keep calm. "It's not what you think," I began, but his roar drowned me out. "Not what I think," he bellowed, his voice shaking the walls. "Ethan, my own son, writing this to you. And you didn't think to tell me?" The air felt suffocating, and just as I tried to regain control of the situation, Ethan appeared in the doorway, drawn by the escalating commotion. He took one look at his father's face and then at mine, and it hit him instantly. "Dad," Ethan said quickly, stepping forward, his voice steady but tinged with guilt. "It's not her fault." "Don't," my husband roared, turning to him with a glare that could freeze fire. "Don't defend her. Don't defend yourself. Do you even realize what you've done?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he held his ground, his voice growing louder to match his father's rage. "I know what I did. I know I crossed a line. But it's not on her, it's on me." "On you?" My husband's laugh was cold, sharp, devoid of any humor. "You think that makes it better? That you can just take the blame and erase this betrayal?" "Dad, stop!" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking under the weight of his emotions. I love her, okay? I've loved her for years. And yes, I was selfish, and yes, I acted on it, but she never. Enough. My husband's voice thundered, his hands slamming down on the table. The sound reverberated through the room, silencing us all. He turned to me, his gaze filled with raw pain. "Did you know? Did you feel the same?" "No," I exclaimed, tears welling in my eyes. "I didn't. I tried to stop him. I pushed him away. I would never betray you. But the doubt in his eyes cut deeper than any accusation. He turned back to Ethan, his expression hardening. "You're my son," he said, his voice quieter now but filled with venom. "And you've destroyed this family." Ethan's resolve cracked, tears streaming down his face. "I know I've ruined everything," he whispered. "But I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Dad. Please. Don't you dare ask for forgiveness," my husband spat. "Not now. Not ever." He stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard it rattled the walls. Ethan sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands, his sobs the only sound in the suffocating silence. I stood frozen, my own tears streaming as the enormity of what had just happened crashed over me. The family we had once been was now shattered beyond repair, and the weight of it crushed us all. I couldn't stay. The tension was suffocating, the trust shattered beyond repair. I had to leave, for his sake, for his father's, and for the family that had already been torn apart. It was the only way to bring some semblance of peace, no matter how much it hurt. That evening, I found Ethan sitting in the garden, his head bowed, the fading sunlight casting shadows over his face. He looked up when I approached, his expression raw and vulnerable, as though he already knew what I was going to say. "I'm leaving," I said softly, my voice trembling. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Leaving? You can't just leave. We can fix this, please, don't go." I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Ethan, this isn't something that can be fixed by me staying. The longer I'm here, the harder it'll be for everyone, especially you and your father. You need time to rebuild what's been broken, and I can't be in the way of that." He stood up suddenly, his voice breaking. "But I need you. I don't care about anything else, I just need you." My heart ached at the desperation in his voice, but I forced myself to remain firm. "Ethan, what you feel right now, it isn't what you think it is. It's not love. It's confusion, a moment of weakness that's grown into something it shouldn't have. I know it feels real, but in time, you'll see that it's not." His hands clenched at his sides, his shoulders trembling. "You don't understand. It is real. I've never felt like this about anyone. I can't just forget it." I stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Ethan, I care about you deeply, but not in the way you want me to. You're young, and your emotions are overwhelming right now, but you have so much ahead of you. You'll find someone who can give you the kind of love you deserve. But that person isn't me." His gaze dropped, tears brimming in his eyes. He looked so lost, so heartbroken, that I wanted to hold him, to tell him it would all be okay. But I couldn't. "If this is what you think is best," he whispered, his voice shaking, "I'll accept it. But it doesn't make it hurt any less." Tears blurred my vision as I forced myself to smile, though it felt hollow. "Thank you, Ethan. One day, you'll look back and see this was the right thing to do. And I promise, you'll be okay." I turned to leave, my chest tight and my heart breaking. Behind me, his voice, barely audible, broke through the silence. "I'll never forget you." I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The tears streaming down my face were proof enough of how much this decision hurt. But I knew that if I looked back, I might not have the strength to walk away. As I closed the door behind me, the house fell silent. I felt the weight of what I was leaving behind, the memories, the mistakes, the pain. But I also knew it was the only way for us all to heal. Sometimes, love doesn't mean holding on. Sometimes, it means letting go, even when it tears you apart.